Hi, my name is Eduarda Dutra, and today my partner Annika Limpert and I will be presenting the Supreme Court case Employment Division versus Smith 1990. This case is one of the most important ones about religious freedom and how far it extends when it conflicts with general state laws, including the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment.
So for our case, the respondents in this were Alfred Smith and Galen Black, who were both members of the Native American Church. They worked as drug rehabilitation counselors, but they were fired from their jobs after using peyote, which was a hallucinogenic drug that is part of their religious ceremonies. After losing their jobs, Smith and Black applied for unemployment benefits, but the Employment Division, Department of Human Resources of Oregon, denied them those benefits. Smith and Black argued that being fired and then denied benefits would violate their First Amendment right to freely exercise their religion, since their peyote was a religious practice. On the other hand, the state agency said that peyote was illegal under Oregon law, regardless of the reason, so the men were ineligible for unemployment benefits. So basically, this case came down to a conflict between religious freedom and the enforcement of neutral state laws.
So now we're going to talk about the basic facts. And here's what happened step by step. First, the case began in Oregon in the 1980s, where Alfred Smith and Galen Black worked at a private drug rehab center that had strict rules against drug use. Even though they used peyote as part of their religious worship at Native American Church, the state law did not understand it as a reason to be excused. In fact, Oregon law had peyote as legal without no exceptions for religious use. Because of the usage, they were both fired. When they applied for unemployment benefits from the Oregon Employment Division, the state said no, arguing that they had broken the law, which in this case, saying that anyone fired for work-related misconduct could not receive unemployment compensation. Thinking that was not fair, Smith and Black then claimed this violated their First Amendment right to freely practice their religion under the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment. Their case then moved through the Oregon courts, first the Oregon Supreme Court and then the Oregon Supreme Court of Appeals actually agreed with them and said that the state's decision violated their free exercise rights, or that peyote's ban was invalid under the Free Exercise Clause. But when the case reached the U.S. Supreme Court, the justices reversed that ruling and decided that Oregon could legally deny benefits and prohibit peyote use, even in a religious ceremony. Fourth, with the facts already stated, Justice Antonin Scalia, as cited before, wrote a majority opinion saying that the Free Exercise Clause does not protect religious practices from neutral, generally applicable laws, in this case, drug laws, just because they have a religious reason. So the court ruled in favor of Oregon. On the other hand, three justices, Blackmun, Brennan, and Marshall, dissented. They argued that Oregon could have made an exception for religious use of peyote, just like other states have done. Justice Blackmun also pointed out that Oregon rarely enforced that peyote ban and that federal government allowed it for religious use. So the state interest wasn't really compelling, but that did not really change the overall conclusions made.
So now I'll be talking about legal issues related to religious freedom. I'll be covering three main points on this slide. The first one is the key question of this case. Second, the constitutional clause. And three, a similar case, Sherbert v. Verner in 1963. This case focuses on the Free Exercise Clause, not the Establishment Clause. The Free Exercise Clause is meant to protect a person's right to practice their religion freely. But the challenge comes when those religious practices conflict with state laws that apply to everyone. Before this case, courts often followed what's called the compelling interest test, which came from Sherbert v. Verner in 1963. Under that test, the government could only restrict a person's religious freedom if it had a very strong or compelling reason, and if there was no less restrictive way to achieve that goal. In fact, the Constitutional Clause claims that Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of religion, which is the main issue discussed amongst the judges when considering Free Exercise Clause is applied to Employment Division versus Smith, which the case is being discussed. So in Sherbert, the court said that denying unemployment benefits to a woman who refused to work on her Sabbath was unconstitutional because the state didn't have a strong enough reason. But in Employment Division v. Smith, the court had to decide whether that same test still applied here, or if a neutral law that wasn't specifically aimed at a religion, like Oregon's ban on peyote, could still be enforced. So the big legal question became, do people have the right to ignore a general law just because it goes against their religion? That's what the court had to figure out in this case.
So now that we've talked about the elements of the case and its parties, the legal issues related to religious freedom, and we've stated the basic facts of Employment Division versus Smith, we will be going over the court's decision. First, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled 6-3 in favor of Oregon, and the court held that the neutral general applicable laws, like Oregon's drug law banning peyote, can be enforced even if they incidentally restrict religious practices. As a result, Smith and Black were denied unemployment benefits even though they had used peyote as a part of Native American religious ceremonies. Yet, we disagree with the judge's majority's decisions, and here's why that is our opinion. First, this ruling limits religious freedom, particularly for minority religions like the Native American Church and other ones, and it seems to go against the spirit of the First Amendment, which is meant to protect people's religious practices. Additionally, the dissenting opinion by Justice Blackmun highlights that federal law allowed peyote used in certain religious contexts, showing that Oregon's strict ban was not the only way to handle this issue. Justice Blackmun also pointed out that the state could have created a narrow exception just as other states, and the federal government allowed to protect religious practices without undermining the law. And in our opinion, the court did not get the balance right. Their decision ended up making it tougher for minority religions to follow their faith when it conflicts with general laws, and even when their practices are harmless, like in this situation.
With that, the case Sherbert v. Verner, as cited before in our issues related to religious freedom slide, was brought up to show how the court previously protected someone's religious freedom in a similar situation involving unemployment benefits. This case also is the case that the lawyers of the respondent, Alfred Smith, used to make a comparison. To give a quick background, Sherbert v. Verner was a 1963 case where Adele Sherbert, a Seventh-day Adventist, was fired because she refused to work on Saturdays, her Sabbath. When she applied for unemployment benefits, South Carolina denied her claim, saying she had refused suitable work. She took it to court, arguing that the denial violated her free exercise rights under the First Amendment. The Supreme Court agreed with Sherbert and ruled in her favor. The court said that the government must show a compelling interest before it can restrict someone's religious practice, and that denying her benefits failed the test.
Now, in Employment Division versus Smith, however, the court decided the opposite way. They ruled, as we have already covered, that the state of Oregon could deny unemployment benefits to Smith and Black, even though their peyote use was part of their Native American church ceremony. The court said that neutral, generally applicable laws, like Oregon's drug laws, do not have to meet the compelling interest test. In order to compare the two, we have to observe that Sherbert v. Verner strongly protected individual religious freedom, requiring the government to justify any burden on it. But in Employment Division v. Smith, the court shifted away from that standard, giving more power to the government to enforce general laws, even if they affect religious practices. Overall, Sherbert really strained religious rights, but Smith kind of flipped that and made it harder for people to claim religious freedom in court, as we've mentioned before regarding to other minority religions.
So in conclusion, in the case Employment Division v. Smith, the Supreme Court held that religious freedom does not allow individuals to break neutral generally applicable laws. The case reshaped how courts interpret the Free Exercise Clause and sparked nationwide debate about how far religious liberty should go in a modern, diverse society. After the decision, many people were upset because it seemed to limit religious freedom, especially for minority religions like Native American Church. This led Congress to pass the Religion Freedom Restoration Act, RFRA, in 1993, which tried to restore stronger protection for religious practices by requiring the government to meet a compelling interest test when restricting religion. Thank you.